Welcome to this video series. I'm Michael Jansen. I am the Chief Research Officer for the Everest Group, and I wanted to introduce one of my colleagues from the industry, somebody that I've worked with for a very long time, not only at the Everest Group, and he's now at Spend Matters, but also back in our history, we worked together at the Hackett Group. And so let me introduce Pierre Mitchell, Chief Research Officer from Spend Matters.
Hello, Michael, and hello, everybody. Really look forward to having this video series with you here. Look forward to it very much.
And you're calling in from Boston. I'm calling in from Dallas.
That's correct. Just outside of Boston, Lexington, Massachusetts, from my home office, like we all are. And given what's going on with COVID-19, that's probably a good thing. So I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, so we did the session last year, and we thought it went so well, we thought we'd do it again this year. The topic's going to be on the contingent workforce, and we all know talent's a big challenge in the industry. And so we're really looking at a segment of that talent picture on the contingent workforce. And we decided to bring some real experts into the equation. So let me introduce Arko.
Thanks, Michael. So I'm Arko, Vice President, and I lead our advisory and research related to talent and HR. And I'm calling in live from Delhi, India.
Okay. And Andrew, you're calling in from the West Coast. You're on the Spend Matters team.
I am indeed. So I'm actually calling in from the San Francisco Bay Area, and at Spend Matters, I am the Research Director of Contingent Workforce and Services.
Okay, fantastic. So let's get into the content. And the way we're going to do this series is actually break it up into 3 videos. We've pulled together information from our studies that we have also respectively done in our organizations, conversations, and our general insight. And the videos are going to start out, one is kind of a macro enterprise view. What are the enterprises concerned about and how are they looking about the problem? Then we're going to drive into some specific research on how the practices of those enterprises and what the best companies are doing to achieve superior results. And then Pierre and Andrew are going to drive us into conversations around the digital disruptions that's happening in the marketplace and all the options that are available to enterprises to implement to improve their practices. So pretty excited about the series we got coming up here. And so let's start with the conversation around what's important to enterprises. And so we did a survey, conversations with enterprises in the marketplace at the very end of 2019 and as we enter 2020. What are they concerned about? And so certainly new business models and price cost pressures and slowdowns in decision making, those are all concerns. But the thing that has shown up in repeated studies over the last few years has been the pressures around talent. And as you see on the slide there, it's the overall talent. And it's not just the number of bodies, but it's also the skills that match up with them. So kind of, if you look at that as being a top 5 issue, that really gives us permission to kind of delve down on this thing. This is not just a HR problem. This is something that's broader than that. And it involves the overall executive leadership, and it also involves the procurement teams as well, because they're responsible for, in many cases, for the contingent workforce conversation. So we've put together a workforce strategy framework here that Pierre and I are going to have a quick conversation around, but really it's breaking into 3 components, and it's not really necessarily geared to be an HR-centric view of the world. It's meant to be a little bit broader view of that. And so we're looking at the overall kind of in our first part of this, the talent strategy, really understanding the availability of talent and the overall supply demand, the sourcing models. We believe that's an extremely important part of the equation. You marry that up with the more traditional people strategies around activation and attracting and retaining talent. And then, of course, we've got the optimization layers of how do you make all that come together and you optimize the workforce, and there's technology and there's analytics and all the good stuff that goes with that. So we've kind of pulled that together into a view. And then what we're doing is we're applying that into different segments of the workforce. So Arko, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So, again, when we talk about different segments of the workforce, it's not about just the people, but rather about ways of doing work. And that can be various ways, right? You have the traditional permanent workforce, and within contingent workforce, you have the traditional avenue of temporary workers. But today there are various other avenues of executing work. That can be statement of work or services procurement, freelancers, interns, crowdsourcing, moonlighting, all of which comes under the broader definition of contingent workforce. And then there is the entire segment around outsourcing, all of which are ultimately various ways of executing work. And ideally, there needs to be some bit of coordination amongst all of these.
So as talent's become more of a challenge for organizations, it sounds like we've got a lot of complexity of solving that problem in terms of different segments of the workforce.
Yeah, exactly. It's wider coordination and some sort of common strategies across all of these, which is needed. Cannot really be looked at in isolation from one another.
So Pierre, how do you look at that? And you've got a framework here that you guys look at it from a supply chain standpoint.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I mean, we kind of primarily serve kind of the procurement and supply chain area, and so certainly we tend to look at this not just as a talent problem and kind of strategic talent management, which is certainly on the on kind of the HR agenda, but also the CEO agenda, because it ultimately does boil down to people. But we also kind of view it as a supply market problem and kind of a supply chain, and basically this is a supply chain of services and talent that's flowing into the organization through multiple channels. Obviously, there's the permanent workforce, but there's also the contingent workforce that takes multiple styles. It could be just steady state access to, to the temporary workforce. It can be access to on-demand gig workers and independent contractors. Also, it's access to services through different types of services suppliers, whether it's MSPs, BPOs, and that's area that you guys cover so well, as well as just general kind of service players that, let's say, a category manager that's managing professional services and corporate services. How do we just manage all of the flow and the consumption of talent, into our organization through multiple channels? And this framework is really something that we did with the Institute for Supply Management. It was a study really just looking at these various supply segments as they kind of flow in from the market through different channels, through these different types of workforce types, into IT and procurement and HR and all the functions, sometimes in a GBS context, ultimately helping to manage this talent flow into the business units, into the supply chains, and ultimately improving the outcomes for the business. And I think the good news is that there is a healthy digital enablement and services enablement marketplace that's ecosystem that's out there, which I'm going to showing here on this next slide. And this is where particularly on the technology side, we kind of cover this, because if you look at services as a mega and talent as a mega kind of spend category, and the contingent workforce as a mega spend category, well, you can say, well, it's really a procurement issue, and looking at it from a source to pay standpoint. So this is why we actually formally cover it from that lens, not so much from kind of the talent lens, but those two worlds need to come together. And maybe this is where, Andrew, if you can just chat a little bit about kind of these segments within the digital ecosystem of on the buy side of all the vendors that we cover in the space. And this is just a sub segment.
Yeah, sure, Pierre. And as you can see, we cover a whole swell of vendors, but specific to the contingent workforce space, several of those, or a limited number of those, are mentioned here. And I would make one point about your last slide, which is that whole space that you had mapped out in the middle of that. It's I would call that the intermediation space, and that's something that is becoming increasingly digitized. So we're going to talk about that a bit later in video 3, but in reference to this slide, there's a box here called VMS, temp staffing. That really represents the core automation segment of the supply chain that has been around for a couple of decades now. But at the same time, there is this robust, diverse set of segments of new emerging technology solution providers that are really starting to have an impact in terms of bringing more integration and cohesion to that intermediation space.
So Andrew, I got to ask you, how many logos are on there? It's like the ultimate eye chart on there. How many logos are on there?
Hey, yeah, well, I have 20/20 vision, so I was able to, through computer assisted counting, I was able to determine there were about 180 on there. And of course, that's a small subset of the actual number.
Are you sure?
Am I sure about the 180? Yes, yes. I subjected this to very detailed and AI-based analysis.
Well, he's doing the supervised training right now, Michael. So we're gonna increase the confidence levels on that, but we'll report back to you on that. But somewhere around 180. But yeah, it is a small number of the overall ecosystem of the providers, both on the contingent side and in those segments, as well as this is actually just limited around kind of core buy side. When you start extending this in the broader supply chain, and not even getting over onto the talent side, I mean, it's a massive market, which is, job security for all the analyst firms like ourselves that really cover all these players, and trying to help the poor practitioners that are trying to make sense of the complexity. So
yeah. One more comment there. I mean, and this is just the technology providers to another whole ecosystem of the actual contingent providers themselves, right? The labor providers.
Correct. Absolutely. And we'll be talking about that in video, maybe a little bit on 2, but certainly in 3, around kind of how you look at, in an everything as a service world, where you have kind of both business process as a service as well as software as a service, and data as a service. A lot of these things are kind of crashing into each other. And as digital starts to kind of consume some of the traditional service offerings, it gets a little messy. So you have to kind of look at say, the MSPs, as both deliverers of the digital capabilities, and how you need to manage that, as well as them just kind of managing the outcomes, which I think you guys are going to really get into in the next video. But anyway, so why don't we I know we need to wrap this up. I just wanted to kind of make one comment here on the procurement side, and kind of representing from a CPO standpoint. CPOs are certainly trying to work with heads of HR and the business to make sure they're getting the services that they need, but also just getting maximum value from those services. And obviously procurement's role tends to be from kind of a cost management standpoint, cost savings, total cost management, et cetera. And one of the challenges is, procurement is trying to say, how do we actually get more bang for the buck with the focus on the bang and the business outcomes? And there's a lot of areas where it's doing pretty well, but one area that is an opportunity area is certainly in the area around workforce planning. And if you look at this list of kind of just from last year, when CPOs were looking at to what extent is procurement really involved in driving these business decisions and influencing that, workforce planning was basically near, there's a few more kind of underneath this, but basically near the bottom of the list in terms of influence. So there's definitely a lot of opportunity to improve. And if you just think about where the world is going to, and everything as a service world, it couldn't be more critical for procurement to work with HR and the rest of the organization to kind of solve this problem, to focus on outcomes, which I think we're going to hit in the next series, Michael. So you want to kind of take us home on this one?
Yeah, so let's wrap there, Pierre, and invite you to attend the next video, where we're going to drill down on the practices that enterprises are implementing to have the best possible outcomes and impact to the organizations. So thank you.